Hey everyone, we are on to the second topic of week 2 here, which is arousal, performance, and enjoyment. And basically here we will just be I'll just be talking about optimal levels of arousal and how that can be dependent on things like whether or not other people are present and how easy or difficult that task is. Um, there is another activity associated with these lectures, which again will be split into 3 videos. And so make sure to stay on top of that. That just consists of a few prompts, and your task is to go through and answer 2 of those. So this first video will be specific to arousal and performance. A key theory for this topic is the Yerkes-Dodson law. Basically, this is just theorizing that there is an inverted U shape between performance and arousal, so something like this. And based on that inverted U shape, typically, for the majority of tasks, moderate levels of arousal are best, but this does seem to depend on task type. So as we see in this chart here, the theory is that for easy tasks, you want higher levels of arousal. For moderate tasks, you want more moderate levels of arousal. And for difficult tasks, you want much less or lower levels of arousal to complete those. So just a few options or a few different tasks to think about in terms of this theory before we go into the next slide would be brain surgery. That would be a difficult task, tying your shoe, easy, and a psychology test. So what arousal level might be best for each of these? First, we have tying your shoe. So again, this would be considered more of an easy task. So if you want to break the world record for fastest time tying your shoes, you probably want a very high level of arousal for that. Versus if you're getting a brain surgery, you probably do not want your brain surgeon to have high levels of arousal. You don't want that brain surgeon to be really stressed because you want the brain surgeon to be able to stay calm, keep the movement steady and everything to perform best for that very difficult task. A psychology exam, on the other hand, relative to these first 2 tasks, can be considered to have moderate levels of difficulty. Therefore, you probably want moderate levels of arousal. You don't want too much arousal because then you might be really nervous and anxious. You might find yourself going through it way too fast and missing some answers, versus if you're too calm and don't have enough arousal while taking the exam, you might not meet the time requirement or might not have the focus that's needed to complete that test to the best of your ability. So some evidence for this theory that there's more of this inverted U shape. So this chart on the right here is a diagram from an arousal level study. What they did was they had participants ride a bike to maintain their arousal level. And at the same time, they completed a time response or response time task, which just involved pressing a button when a light came on as they were riding their bikes. Oops. And so what they found was evidence for this inverted U shape where moderate levels of arousal as measured by heart rate, percentage of heart rate reserve, that was associated with the best response time versus low arousal. The response time wasn't as good. High arousal, again, response time wasn't as good. And so to perform best on the response time task. The moderate level of arousal was best. So next we'll get into the whole Spence drive theory. I feel like oftentimes when we start talking about different theories in psychology, we kind of expect them to contradict each other. This isn't the case here. Really what whole Spence drive theory is doing is providing a possible explanation of the Yerkes-Dodson. So the Yerkes-Dodson just shows that, hey, this happens, but doesn't provide too much of an explanation for why that happens. So that's where whole Spence comes in. And so whole Spence theorizes that high drive or arousal increases responding and brings out the dominant or the most common response for that task. And now how we figure out what the most dominant response is dependent on the task and whether that task is easy or difficult. So based on this theory, when the task is easy, the correct response is dominant, or that's the most typical or common response, versus with a difficult task, just by definition, by nature, that's going to be harder, and the incorrect response for difficult tasks is going to be dominant. And so the result of this is when there is a lot of arousal and the task being completed is difficult, there will be a lot of incorrect responses. Getting into the influence that others have on arousal and task performance. The first aspect of this is social facilitation. So just the mere presence of others in arousal in general is something that is consistently applied to for arousal research. And so the first aspect of this is social facilitation, where the presence of others enhances or improves performance. So in this study on the right here, it was found that bicycle riders went faster when riding with each other and competing against other people than when just racing by themselves against the clock. So that's an example of social facilitation, where the presence of others, the presence of other competing individuals, or the presence of a crowd here improves speed on the bike. And so, yeah, the explanation is that the crowd or other competitors increases arousal and brings out the dominant response. Something to think about here is whether biking is easy or difficult. So you would think that this only applies to people who either know how to ride bikes pretty well or are experts at riding bikes, because then that task becomes easy, relatively easy. You don't have to think too much about how to stay up on that bike, versus if you're just learning how to ride a bike, these results might be a little different, right? Because if you're consistently not able to stay up on the bike, or if you're falling all over the place, it's certainly plausible that at that point, having other people around watching you fall and fall and fall might have an opposite effect here. So kind of an explanation of that last slide, going off of a bit what I was talking about at the end there in terms of whether the task is easy or difficult. First of all, so the correct pronunciation of the name is Zayant. And so I've studied Zayant's theories and studies for a while now, and still have the tendency to say Zajunk. That is not the correct pronunciation. It is Zayant's. But anyways, yeah, so basically tested social facilitation and found through various studies that I'll talk about on the next slide that are pretty interesting, found that the presence of another person or a member of the same species, that second part, is in there because science typically use studies on various animals as opposed to humans. But anyways, this presence increases arousal, which then strengthens the dominant response. And the effect of this depends on whether the task is easy or difficult, with easy tasks then leading to correct responses and better performance, whereas difficult tasks leading to incorrect responses and performance impairment. So the Zion's cockroach study or studies, pretty interesting here. Social psychologists in general, especially back in the day, came up with some pretty interesting ideas for studies and then applied them to humans. Had some pretty crazy imaginations. This definitely is not where my mind would go, I think, if I was trying to test social facilitation. But anyways, so tested the social facilitation interaction with task difficulty hypothesis, used cockroaches. And so the one main thing known about cockroaches is that when lights come on, they hate it and they go run away and try to find dark places. So that was the idea with the setup here. And so basically you see that there's two different mazes. And so this is the simple maze where when the light comes on, the cockroach just has to run straight, versus when the light comes on with the complex maze, in order to get to the end there, that dark area, the cockroach is going to have to take a right, which in the realm of cockroaches is much more difficult than going straight. Additionally, with the social facilitation aspect of this, included were audience boxes where other cockroaches were placed in there to watch. I don't know if they were cheering or if they had their cowbells or what. But yeah, basically what was found was support of the hypothesis. So an audience of other cockroaches helped performance in the simple maze and harm performance in the complex maze. Now, we can get into kind of the opposite effect that audiences or other being in groups can have, which is that of social loafing, which is where having others there decreases performance or impairs it. And so this occurs especially on joint tasks. I think the easiest way to think about this, especially in a school setting, is with group projects. So I think that the most common complaints with group projects is that, so-and-so didn't do anything, and this is called social loafing. And so this was shown in a study here where participants were instructed to cheer or clap, and then it was manipulated how many people were around doing that cheering and clapping, whether it was 1, 2, 4, sorry, that's cut off, it should be 6. But basically, as group size increased, we see social loafing, where the individual cheering or clapping sound from each person decreased, as those group sizes increased. And so the key aspect to notice here is the difference between individual and joint performance and the influence that can have on whether you see social loafing or social facilitation, such as in the individual performance here with cockroaches or, riding a bike versus clapping or cheering in groups. So final slide here, again, just kind of reiterating what I was just talking about in terms of there being an interaction between evaluation type and task that determines whether you are more likely on average to see, and this definitely isn't always the case, but whether you're more likely on average to see social facilitation or social loafing. So we see that for individual evaluation on an easy task, this is often good for performance and you get social facilitation, versus when there's more of a group evaluation and the task is still easy, like clapping or cheering or something, then you'll get some, on average, social loafing where the performance is harmed. So that's it for this video. Next, we'll get into the, harms of lots of increases or high levels of arousal in certain scenarios and the forms of test anxiety and choking.